Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. A Glimpse of the Kingdom can remain free because of generous donors like you. If you'd like to donate, feel free to do so online, or you can send payments through Facebook Messenger. Don't forget to tell your friends about it so that they can enjoy this ministry as well. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any podcasts.
You can listen to my daddy every single day, like in the gym, in the car, or just at home. Glimpse of the Kingdom is awesome!
Hello. Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. Jordan Peterson. If you don't know that name, it probably means you do not have a social media account of any kind. No, that's mostly true. Jordan Peterson is everywhere online. I think he has like 1 trillion YouTube videos. No, not that many, but it is a lot. Jordan Peterson is I think 55-year-old Canadian clinical psychologist who taught at Harvard for a little bit, but mostly he is from and teaches in Canada, and Toronto, University of Toronto in particular. He became real popular just a couple years ago and then made huge headlines not too long ago because in Canada there was a new law that was expanding called C-16. C-16 was a bill that sought to expand human rights by adding gender identity and gender expression as possible reasons to be considered discriminatory. That is to say, if you do anything or say anything that discriminates against gender identity or gender expression, you can be penalized under the law. Now, the consequences vary. You could lose your job. You might go to prison. You might be fined. And it really comes down to the main point that Peterson really did not like. He doesn't like the left and the leftism and liberalism, I think, too, but it's certainly the left. His main form of contention was the fact that you had to say the words and the pronouns, the names and the pronouns that a transgender person chose for him or her, or it or they or Zed self. And if you didn't say those things, you were under penalty of the law. If you don't know what I'm talking about, people who believe that gender is purely a social construct and absolutely independent of your sex, which most people now define as something related to your biology, though even transgenders attack that as well, particularly on the far left, because they're arguing that there's no distinction whatsoever between male and female, that it too is a social construct. But that's not my podcast today. I think that's absurd. Anyway, so does Peterson. But when a transgender person says, my new name is Betsy or Squirrel or whatever, and my pronoun is something new, they'll make up new pronouns. Instead of he and she, they might say Zed or Zed or they, goosebumps. I mean, you can make up anything you want. And the idea is that every single time, and I'm serious, if you don't know this is very serious. This is all over major universities, particular secular universities. When you meet a person, you're supposed to ask them, which pronouns do you prefer? That's what you're supposed to ask. And if they say, my pronoun is Zillow, you're supposed to say, okay, all right, Zillow, and what's your name? My name is Betsy Tom. Hi, Betsy Tom. So, tell me about yourself, Zillow, or what. I mean, point is, that's the point. From then on in the conversation, you're supposed to use the pronouns that Betsy Tom made up for him or her itself, because they believe that gender is what they call non-binary. It's not he or she. It's anything, a fluid. And I've lost count of how many gender identities now there are. There's so many that it's unbelievable. Well, the point is, back to the C-16 bill, it made it a you might say criminal offense. You made it illegal, certainly on the university campus, to refuse to say that made-up pronoun for a person. They said, call me Zed or call me Zillow, and you don't say Zillow, you're in a lot of trouble. Well, Jordan Peterson made a couple of videos that said, I'm not doing it, because if this is the case, it means this university, of course the government there in Canada, now can tell me what I can and cannot say. So he actually, when in billions of interviews, he's not that much against using a different pronoun, especially if the pronoun becomes an efficient and useful way of speaking about other human beings. Fine. What he's very much against is being penalized if you don't use the particular pronoun a person wishes. Well, that means the government's forcing me to use words. And it makes him very upset because this whole issue, in his view, is, and I'm completely in concurrence with him, it's an ideological push by the far left. So, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, I'm reading from the quote, they found that in a workplace or a school, quote, refusing to refer to a trans person by their chosen name and a personal pronoun that matches their gender identity would almost certainly be considered discrimination. And because he refuses to do that, he's been called, everything from a liberal to an alt-right to a woman hater, a man hater, a trans hater, and whatever. And he's become overwhelmingly popular. And the reason why, of course, is, I have my reflections here in a second. But Jordan Peterson's out there. And I want to say just a few quick things about him that might be worth reflecting upon. A few things I really appreciate about Jordan Peterson, and a couple things that we might part ways on, and if you listen to him, maybe forms of encouragement for you. One thing is I completely concur with him. I think when a government can tell us that it is illegal not to use certain words. Now, the U.S. is different because we have the First Amendment, and the fact that if I could, and it might sound crazy, but it's not far away. It is all over in university campuses right now, the degree to which we have to say certain genders. I watched several things online constantly. I've seen a guy, which I'll talk about in another podcast, Steven Crowder. He's done discussions on university campuses. But it's commonplace now in many universities, and I've seen this on news interviews, news channels. This is just commonplace, becoming more and more commonplace, that refusing to use someone's pronoun is an act of violence. It is an act of violence. And that's one way that this particular ideology is attempting to form the conversation. Since, particularly in the U.S., we have the ability to, though it's highly contested, to have free speech. By definition, to have free speech means to be able to say things that someone else might not like. But when you redefine it, so, well, I can't call it, you might have the freedom, but if I can characterize what you're saying is a hate speech, and the hate speech is an act of violence, then an act of violence is a crime. So there's a swath of people, you might say, who are attempting very, very hard to consider this an act of violence. Because in their mind, not allowing these words and pronouns that are made up to be used is a way of hurting a person, and it leads to violence. It leads to people being abused and being killed and so forth. I absolutely disagree, and I concur with Peterson, who would say a similar thing. I think it's abject nonsense to suggest that if a person doesn't call another person by a stated, suggested, begged for pronoun, that is an act of violence. We've gone crazy. We've gone crazy. Society has gone nuts. Crazy. I don't know a better word. We've gone crazy. So one thing is I appreciate about Peterson is his argument. The second thing I appreciate about Jordan Peterson is that, and I don't know all of his work, and I've not read his books. I know of them. I've listened to many of his talks and lectures and debates, and so I'm not at all speaking comprehensively, and I don't know every word he's ever said. But my second point is what I appreciate about Jordan Peterson is the fact that he is resolute. He doesn't shrink back. He has a view and states it clearly and articulately without incessant ad hominem argument. So he'll present these talks and lectures and whatnot, and the people and the videos will come up, and they're screaming and hollering, cussing and fighting and punching and all kinds of stuff, and he's just talking. And I appreciate that fact a lot, that people are trying to have conversations. Now, thirdly, I might say, appreciate, here's a guy with 3 degrees and certainly has his PhD in clinical psychology who is well researched So this isn't just off the cuff. He's not trying to rile people up. He's making reasoned arguments, and I appreciate that about him. The one area with which I disagree, we part ways, before I tell you, I have to give a little context. His real specialty in clinical psychology is following the great thinkers Freud, Jung, and others, but Jung is his big dog. Jung is his favorite. Carl Jung is a very influential, well-known psychotherapist who, in a nutshell, argued and practiced his therapy with the assumption that all of history moves on, going forward, you might say, to various degrees, repeating humans' myths. So things that occurred, stories that are told, the history of humanity is almost always encapsulated in the various myths that humans tell. And so you hear often in Peterson's talks, and he'll say this often, I mean, he refers often to his background and training in Jungian psychology. So he looks for types. The types. He does that. His typology is very common. And if you don't know much about that, do some research on Carl Jung, YouTube search, whatever. Where I part ways, and that's fine. I don't find Jungian psychology that persuasive. But where part ways is Peterson. Well, let me say the positive first. Well, something I like about Peterson is I think he's a Christian. I think he is. He grew up Protestant, and I certainly think kind of left the faith. I'm not sure. I think he would consider himself a theist now, and I think a Christian now. What I really appreciate is Peterson will quite, I don't know, naturally, organically talk about life and life's issues and life's problems, and then quote or paraphrase a teaching from the New Testament. Now, he very seldom says, and this is what Jesus said. Typically, he'll say, this reminds me of something in the New Testament. I really appreciate that someone who is at this level, worldwide fame and controversy, that when he's making arguments about the way to understand life, he's quoting from the New Testament. I mean, who else can you think of who does that right now? And does it unashamedly? I think that's amazing and awesome in the way to do it. I think it's wonderful. Where we part ways is that he typically reads the Bible through a Jungian psychological framework. And that's where we part ways. So, for example, I've heard him do lectures on Adam and Eve and several other things when it comes to the Bible. And it's not that it's all wrong. It's just that I would say it's mostly wrong. What I mean is, based on how I and anybody who's trained in scholarship in the field approaches the issue. We don't approach Genesis 1 and 2, for example, let's say Adam and Eve, which is particularly in Genesis 2 and 3. We don't approach Genesis 2 and 3 and Adam and Eve's story through the lens of Jung. We don't approach the teaching of Jesus through the lens of Jung and typology and so forth. We don't. We're trained to read it in historical literary context. So we ask, what is the genre? How is this genre understood in the ancient world? How would an ancient person have read this and understood it? And then if we are, particularly for Christian, and we care how to apply it, then we seek to apply it only in sequence. That is to say, after we have explored the exegesis, the historical literary context of the ancient world. Peterson has apparently no training in that whatsoever, which makes the biblical texts that I've heard him quote, and to which he alludes, more kind of like an ink blot, to where it's something he finds convincing and amazing and cool, but if you presented that same paper at, say, the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, it wouldn't be taken seriously. You might say this is an interesting psychological or a Jungian approach to interpretation, and that's fine. That's fine. You can do that. There's feminist reading of the text and black reading of the text, liberation theology reading of the text, and there have been various attempts at what Peterson does in his approach. So you can do it. It's just that where we part ways is I think that what he's doing there isn't very fruitful for what we should be doing. And so if you listen to Peterson, listen to what he says about the Bible, that's my one word of encouragement. So it's not to dismiss him. It's to understand I guess, that proverbial grain of salt. Understand that when he's reading it, he is deliberately, and I think he usually says explicitly, reading it and interpreting it as a clinical psychologist, not as someone who's trained in the field. And because of that, it depends on what you find valuable. If you want to read the text with the same lens, then you might find his insights great. If, however, you're asking the question of every text, what did an ancient Hebrew thinker think, and what did it mean to them back then Peterson, unfortunately, is not your guide. He's not your guy. But anyway, besides that, I still very much appreciate that he's going to the text in 2018 to audiences who have come to listen to him, and we have very few, you might say predominantly understood to be secular speakers, ever doing that and being so sympathetic to the insight that one can glean from the scriptures. And boy, we could use more of that. So if you ask me, if you had to do either Peterson never talks about the Bible, or because he doesn't do the historical context, or he keeps doing what he's doing, I'd rather him keep doing what he's doing if I had to choose, because I think the great benefit of what he's doing. But having said that, that's my word of encouragement for you if you listen to him much. So who knows if this is more of a fad for the moment, but as long as Jordan Peterson's out there with a big name and big following and big YouTube following, and on it goes, perhaps God will use that for his glory and help other people go back to the biblical text more and more and see it as something that's actually applicable to their daily lives now versus an old, dusty, worthless Iron Age document. I think it's what the atheists call it, Iron Age, which is dumb. But anyway, God bless you. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, and also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom, or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways to reach out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.